Thank you so much for coming today. I'm Liz Hutchison, Professor of Latin American History. I'm happy to see many folks I know, many folks I don't, and have an opportunity to gather here and do what we do in the academy, right? Which is start fights, right? And really treasure the opportunity to keep doing that. So I'm so glad you could join us for this. Welcome to Colombia Revisited, a conversation about Colombian history from the 1820s to the present, grounded in our visitors' newly published, edited volumes, Histories of Solitude and Histories of Perplexity, just out from Routledge Press. And we're going to circulate some copies. 2 of them belong to the library, and 2 of them are mine, so don't walk away with my copy, okay? We're incredibly fortunate to have them here, and wish to give them a rousing New Mexico bienvenida. Yes. Thank my co-organizers, Luisa Ranavila and Dr. Les Field as well, and our sponsors, which are many: LAII, the Department of History, Department of Anthropology, International Studies, Political Science, Spanish and Portuguese, and the College of Arts and Sciences. Everyone contributed and made this all possible. I'm now happy to be able to introduce our guests, and I'll make it quick because I know you want to hear from them. They're prepared to tell you a lot about Colombian history, the community of scholars it represents, and the book project as a whole. But as our visitors themselves suggested in Dr. Field's seminar yesterday, it's also important that we understand the formation and perspective of those who have produced this work. In that spirit, I assembled a little bit of information about each of them that I think may be helpful for understanding their scholarship. And of course, they will add to this, I'm sure. Dr. Lina Britto is a Colombian scholar, trained in both Colombia with degrees in journalism and anthropology from the Universidad de la Cordillera and the Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana, and a PhD in Latin American history from New York University. Come on in, you can come in more if you want. And in 2020 published the book Marijuana Boom, The Rise and Fall of Colombia's First Drug Paradise with the University of California Press, and has multiple related articles in US and Latin American journals. She's also supported the work of Colombia's Historical Commission of the Armed Conflict and its victims, and convened multiple panels examining the Colombian peace process. So clearly she doesn't sleep, right? Dr. Ricardo López-Pedreros, also Colombian, but just as important as his training in Colombia and the United States at the University of Maryland, Ricardo is my friend. And I say this because I also want us to be talking about how we build a community of scholars over time. Ricardo is a colleague who has not only bravely insisted on the importance of gender as a category of analysis in the history of Colombian middle classes, but he's also been a generous participant in my graduate seminars on gender and sexuality, which I really appreciate. Professor of history at Western Washington University, Dr. Lopez has published several highly praised works in our field, including the volume co-edited with the extraordinary Barbara Weinstein, his monograph on the Colombian middle classes, Makers of Democracy, and the co-edited volume, The Middle Classes in Latin America, published with Routledge. If you don't think the study of middle classes is radical or sexy, you should read his work. I want to say something at closing about their commitments to impactful scholarship. In addition to Dr. Britto's work in Colombia's recent peace process, Dr. Lopez as well has done research in this area, and both done extensive news and public media work, particularly Dr. Britto's work on the drug trade. She also directed a documentary film and contributed to a dance theater consultation. So ask about people's varied interests and talents. These new volumes that we're looking at today, and you cannot steal from me, embody these commitments, and I want to say something more about edited volumes in closing. To succeed in publishing a good edited collection, scholars need to be builders of community, leaders who command respect. Without those skills, Scholars will not agree to devote months of their time to produce a chapter, actually turn it in, or improve the work based on the editor's comments. And if your contributors still like you at the end of the process, that's a plus. The volumes we're looking at today beautifully illustrate how Ricardo and Lina overcame these challenges to produce important new work. So I'd like to welcome them again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and thank you all of you for being here. As we were talking yesterday at Professor Field's class, we don't take these kinds of occasions for granted because we know how rare these kind of opportunity to sit down and talk for an hour or two or whatever it is on a project that you were working on for many years. So we really appreciated that. And thanks in particular to Professor Hutchinson, Professor Herrán Avila, and Professor Field, who have been our hosts and have been very gracious to us. So what we're going to do today is to share some of some of the big ideas that are the common threads that organize this project that is very diverse, that is not necessarily based on consensus. Some people approach topics and things one way and others in a different way, and that's the whole point of the two edited volumes. But there are some common threads and some big ideas that help us to put together these two volumes and all the different works that contain from the early 19th century until practically now, because volume 2 is very much about the present times and the last decades in Colombia. In order to start kind of like sharing those big ideas, we like to start with a piece of news. Let's see if this works. Yes, perfect. So this happened just a few days after Trump's inauguration on January 26. We woke up to the very first diplomatic crisis of the Trump administration. How it happened? While most of us were sleeping at 3 a.m. local time in Colombia, Colombian President Gustavo Petro took to X to criticize the United States for its handling of deportations after learning that the Colombian migrants that were being deported back to Colombia were handcuffed on board of the flights. So this is what he tweeted or posted on X. The U.S. cannot treat Colombian migrants as criminals. I disallow the entry of U.S. planes carrying Colombian migrants into our territory. So the two U.S. flights that were about to land in Colombia had to return mid-air to the United States. In the meantime, Trump responded also on X with a series of sanctions against the South American country, including 25% tariffs on all goods. So that's what he responded a few hours later. So what happened during the next 24 hours was an altercation between the two presidents over social media, in addition to obviously diplomatic negotiations behind closed doors. So that was one of many Petro's response to Trump. So the fight between Petro and Trump sparked a debate about migration, human rights, sovereignty, and interstate relations in the Americas. These are some of the people that joined in the conversation. So politicians and pundits of all stripes chime in, including the Nobel Peace Prize winner and former Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos. So a few weeks later, we just realized that this was just the opening salvo of Trump's trade wars, which continue with Canada and Mexico and other countries, but mostly those two who are U.S. closest commercial allies in the hemisphere. So once again, Colombia served as a testing ground of initiatives and policies that will later become the norm. So located in the northernmost section of South America, between two geostrategic regions, the Panama Canal and Venezuela's oil district, Colombia has been a long-standing bridge between the Caribbean, the Andes, the Pacific, and the Amazon basin, and a key ally in the consolidation of U.S. hegemonic project in the hemisphere. So yesterday when we were visiting Professor Phil's class, we were talking about the importance of geography to understand Colombian history. And that's why we like to start here with the geostrategic location of the country, because that fact that is a bridge between all these different regions, the Caribbean, the Pacific, the Andes, and the Amazon, it's not gratuitous. It is absolutely central to understand Colombian history. So despite all this, Colombia barely figures in public conversations in the United States, whether these conversations take place in the public sphere of the media or in academic conversations in classrooms and in the curricula. And frustration at this realization is what prompted us to put this project together. So Cameroonian author Leonora Miano has been very inspiring to us. One of the things that she wrote in one of her many books really spoke to our motivations for this project. So she said, books are born from an intense and pressing questioning that pushes oneself towards writing, not to say what one knows, but to try to say something and to know something. So these volumes are no exception. They had been in the making for a long time, shaped by our own research agendas and professional trajectories, conditioned by how we have embodied and resisted the foundational narratives and silences about the histories of Colombia that we question in these volumes, and organized according to our capacities to make sense of those narratives and those silences in hindsight. So as children of the 1970s and 1980s, we, the editors, are members of a generation that witnessed the collapse of the dominant liberal consensus worldwide, a time that in Colombia it was lived as a tremendously ideologized era. However, at school, history felt static. As we grew older, we realized that history was not stagnant outside of our classrooms. So our youth coincided with the ferocious advance of the paramilitary armies from Antioquia in the northwest part of the country. Medellin is the capital city. So the paramilitary advance from Antioquia to the rest of the country, where a scorched earth war ensued against guerrillas. Guerrillas whose exponential growth at the time in the 90s, as a result of the taxes that they were imposing on coca and cocaine production, made them indomitable enemies. So in the middle of all this chaos and this war, we found sources of inspiration and a formative experience at college, learning and building our own intellectual landscapes on the humanities and social sciences. History, anthropology, sociology, journalism save us from the cataclysm as much as the daring curiosity of our youth and the vigorous cultural and artistic scenes that characterize Colombia at this time and still does today. And we mention this because it's only now in hindsight, now that we are middle-aged, that we realize how not just, humanities and social sciences in college were kind of like our safety net against all this chaos and this war, but also the cultural and artistic currents and communities and environments that we experience in our youth, from like music, partying, bars, like you name it, organized, disorganized in whatever way. It was very central, and it continued to be very important right now in Colombia, and is part of the project. And you'll see how we kind of like consider that as well as part of, important aspects of the history of the country that needed to be addressed.
All right, but and something important for our current context, right? Keep that cultural production inside. So knowing the past matters for what teaches us about the present. We left Colombia at the turn of the new millennium and began our lives in the United States. As we went through the taxing rite of passage for grad school, we were introduced to a robust literature in Latin America and the Caribbean that considered the role of the dispossessed, the subaltern, the destitute as historical actors in the formation of different countries in the region. These new approaches were making possible new interpretations about the nation, the state, citizenship, and democracy. Nevertheless, our country barely figured in our curriculum. As we began to spend more time conducting research for our dissertation, we witnessed the Frankenstein of the war on terror and the war on drugs that Washington financed under Plan Colombia and beyond in action. We understood that the conspicuous absence of our country in the classroom transcends to the media. The confirmation that invisibility is the price to pay for being a repository of uncomfortable truth about US power in the America has shaped our professional lives in the United States. What could the histories of Colombia explain about Latin America and the world, if anything at all? What does it mean to work on Colombia in an increasingly globalized planet? Who is entitled to tell the histories of Colombia? Why Colombia? Scholars tend to portray Colombia's historical trajectory as so unique that it hardly parallels others. How else can we explain that counterintuitive combination of a strong constitutional system and alarming levels of violence, if not as a rarity, an anomaly, or an exception? Colombia is usually presented in academic and popular literature as follows: a labyrinth, a country of cities without citizens, a democracy without the people, an impenetrable thing, a narco-democracy, a society in which modernity is forever deferred or elusive, a comedy of errors, a country of bullets, and these are only just some of the descriptions here, where an idiosyncratic political culture produced a modernization that works against modernity. In short, as David Bushell put it in his seminal work of 1993, a nation in spite of itself. With these two volumes, we question these narratives, and instead, we explore the relevance of Colombia for a better historical understanding of democratic orders for various angles and perspectives. As editors, what we do is to offer a collection of histories of Colombia as histories of democracy. What the authors do is to rescue several democratic experiments in various places and moments in time, which have been forgotten or silenced as unreasonable, impracticable, or undisposable. They also historicize how certain definitions and practices of democracy have gained normativity and legitimacy while eclipsing others. In so doing, the authors distance themselves from the idea that democracy is a given or taken for granted, and instead recognize that it requires conflict. That is to say, they consider the advances and setbacks, expansions and contradictions, inclusion and exclusion, and process of hierarchical ordering are foundational to democracy. Collectively, this project proposed to bring democracy to the historical terrain, to de-idealize it, seen as a contingent rather than preordained, and illustrate how multiple groups have fought over the meanings, subjectivities, practices, institutions, politics, economics, and rationalities of democracy. Please.
So we organize kind of like those big ideas of common threads in like 3 different groups. So the first one is liberalism and citizenship, that we can call them more like debates or conversations, right? Because as I said, nothing is really settled, and we are not aiming to reach any kind of consensus in this volume. But there are kind of like the big debates in which many of these essays explore or the topics that they address. So liberalism and citizenship, development and neoliberalism, and memory and violence. So in the first volume, that is Histories of Solitude, Colombia 1820s, 1970s, we begin by inquiring how different actors redefine the meanings and practices of republicanism and liberalism. So for example, the essay by Nancy Applebaum follows an intellectual and scientific vanguard as they imagine a republic after the wars of independence. So the 19th century has been conceived for a long time as the source of the country's problems. 20th century historians influenced by modernization and dependency theories painted a picture of the 19th century as a historical disappointment. They agreed that Colombian elites unsuccessfully imitated European and US models. And they also agreed that they failed to create the conditions of modernity and national unity. Liberalism was a chimera. So these contributions demonstrate, the contributions in the volume 1 in Solitude, demonstrates that the early republic was not that picture is not very accurate, because the early Colombian Republic was not so different from other places in the Americas or even across the Atlantic. So they show how different social sectors, both elite groups and popular groups, engage in political experiments to materialize democracy, finding inspiration in liberals' ideas of citizenship, popular sovereignty, freedom, and inclusion. Another example is the work by Ana Maria Otero Cleves. You have the first photo of the plaza just right there, comes from her essay. So she elaborates on how a national market of consumption in which popular sectors participated actively and reshaped was created in Colombia in relation to the global economy. So she challenges the narrative that the 19th century in Colombia, or that Colombia in the 19th century was an isolated autarky, right? An isolated economy, like a little island in the middle of nowhere, right? And she analyzes instead what was at stake in this struggle over the practices and meanings of consumptions of foreign goods by popular sectors. Another example is by Catalina Muñoz and Juan Fernando Velázquez. Each one in their own essay, they invite us to pay close attention to cultural politics from above and from below, and how through culture and arts became like different sectors engage in struggles about the questions of who are the people, who are the Colombian people, and what is the role of the people in a democracy, and how they imagine and intensely thought about that in the cultural realm is part of the main contributions of these two essays. So then we have the question of development and neoliberalism that is kind of like spread out in the two volumes. It started the conversation in volume 1, Solitude, and continues in volume 2 in Perplexity. So the question of development and its transformation into neoliberalism is the next big historical problem that we tackle in these volumes. So we start in volume 1, untangling the national and transnational conditions under which a new paradigm of development was invented by a constellation of actors. So we locate this inception of this paradigm of development not in the early Cold War period, which is usually how we study this for Latin America, including Colombia, but in the 1930s, in the economic crisis of the 1930s, and what prompted both state actors and social actors to do in the context of that crisis. So what we do here is that we go beyond the narratives of failure, right? That Colombia it failed in developing a modern economy, right? Or achieving that paradigm of development. We go beyond those narratives of failure to show instead how development, the idea of development, became a field of force in which the meanings and practices of democracy were contested. So let me give you an example. We don't have an image from that essay because that essay came out without photographs or any images, but the essay by Susana Romero, a historian, explains the history of credit in the first half of the 20th century and how through the policy of credit, the Liberal Party, who came back to power in the 1930s, produced an idealized economic and political subject for a developed Colombian economy and democracy. And that idealized economic and political subject was the male small farmer. So the male small farmer of the 1930s liberal republic continued to be the ideal economic subject during the rest of the century. And I even say, even until now, even though it has changed a lot, in great part thanks to the social movement of victims, where women have played a very important role. But I will argue, and that is my personal opinion, that it continues to be the ideal economic and political subject, the male small farmer. So in this essay by Susana Romero and other essays in volume 1, we talk about how these mid-century modernizing projects of commercial agriculture try to resolve the agrarian question, the land question, with technological innovations aiming at modernizing the male small farmer. So revisiting these debates and controversies and conflicts about the role of agricultural technologies, the small farmer, we unpack the racialized and gender discourses and practices that shaped the process of modernization in Colombia since before the Cold War and during the Cold War. So we also show how the question of development in Colombia was part and parcel of a transnational discussion and conversation that took place during these decades, and that in Colombia, especially in the 1950s and 1960s, unraveled in a context of political and social violence. So what kind of peace and democracy did development, the paradigm of development and the ideal of development, promised to deliver in Colombia? So in some cases, developmental programs promise peace through the uplifting of the popular sectors, turning them into middle classes. For example, the essay by Orlando de Ávila Pertús. So the photograph is this one in the inferior part of the country where you see a group of men kind of like building a road. So that essay by Orlando de Ávila Pertús, also a historian, illustrates that development was not just a top-down initiative, like the essay, another essay in that volume by Andrés Álvarez, Margarita Fajardo, and Jimena Hurtado discussed. And we have the photo of that essay, is the one up there. Well, you can see all the white Criollo politicians at the presidential palace. So that essay by Álvarez, Fajardo, and Hurtado discussed this ideal of development from an elite perspective, from the perspective of the policymakers and the people in charge of the state apparatus. In the case of Orlando de Ávila Pertús, the other photo, right, he looks at the paradigm of development from below. And he uses the case of Cartagena in the Caribbean coast to illuminate how these visions from below, these movements, neighborhood movements fighting for equality and inclusion, subverted elite notions of development and forced them to change that ideal and that paradigm. So together, all these contributions invite us to think critically about the developmentalist state in the context of the Cold War, prior to the Cold War and during the Cold War. So the paradigm of development, more than an elite idea, right, that in the case of Colombia was imposed through an elite pact between liberals and conservatives, which was called the National Front. So more than just an elite pact that imposed itself through clientelism and state violence as well, the bipartisan system that ruled Colombia at this time in the name of development and modernization, they actually enjoy a certain degree of legitimacy because this paradigm of development offers opportunities to different social groups to appropriate the discourse of the state and also state programs to achieve better economic conditions and making a claim to democracy. However, the political rationality that underpinned this brand of developmentalism simultaneously criminalized and delegitimized alternative definitions of democracy. So contrary to what most scholarships suggest, The political radicalization of the 1960s and 1970s that happened in Colombia, but in many other countries of Latin America as well, was not preordained or imposed from outside. In the case of Colombia, the official discourse always talk about Cuba, right? Cuba is exporting revolution of the Soviet bloc, right? It was not. These works, these essays suggest that actually that political radicalization and revolutionary spirit was a creation from within the National Front and their developmental programs. So in the case of Colombia, we didn't have a dictatorial rule as a response to these radical politics and revolutionary movements, like other countries in Latin America had in the 70s and 80s. But the challenges that Colombia went through during these decades unfolded also as part of the histories of the Cold War in the Americas. And what was at stake was precisely the meanings of both development and democracy.
All right, so the all-encompassing crisis of the 1970s is the point of departure for our examination of the origins of neoliberalism, and is unfolding until our present times in volume 2, by the title Histories of Perplexity. And here, one of the most influential scholarly explanations, and I'm sure you are familiar with some of these explanations about neoliberalism in Latin America, is that it's the product of the so-called shock therapy, shock doctrine, a policy crafted mostly by U.S. trained economists and first implemented as a political project by Latin American military regimes through the suspension of democratic rule and thanks to the capitulation of national elites and civil authorities. True enough. This line of interpretation considers the endurance and longevity of neoliberalism as a result of its power to advance the interests of transnational financial elite and the creation of a supranational state capable of inoculating capitalism against the threat of democracy. So the main argument is that neoliberalism was indeed a threat to democracy. We want to question that particular assumption behind that. Again, taking this for the histories of development, the histories of democracy, then what is the vision of neoliberal democracy that's going to gain some legitimacy? Because when we actually put neoliberalism on one hand and democracy on the other, we use neoliberalism as a critique in itself. That is neoliberal. And if you actually say from the left, then that's a critique. But if you say from the right, that is indeed something else. But what else is there, right? And then democracy is taken for granted. We cannot see then how that vision of neoliberal democracy came about. In the case of Colombia, most interpretations of neoliberalism explain its dominance in terms of its malleability of renewing oligarchical rule, all-powerful oligarchical rule. Recent works have demonstrated that Colombian policymakers and economists, like everywhere else across the America, selectively sorted out the economic functions, resources, and practices that could work for a neoliberal society during the crisis of the 1970s, before dismantling the active role of the state, the developmentalist state, to promote industrialization and modernization. These studies, this is actually quite an interesting interesting argument to say the least, because these studies end up rescuing the agency of national elites, right? And demonstrate how neoliberalism was not a complete break with the past, nor an imposition from abroad, but the political product of the continuing consolidation of a mixed economy and the result of local initiative elites to address national needs. Histories of Perplexity builds upon this new literature. The volume takes inspiration in the essay by William Mina Aragon, the first essay, on volume 2, which explored in conversation with Afro-Colombian intellectual Manuel Zapata Olivella the place of Colombia in Latin America and the Americas, and the indigenous peoples and peoples of African descent in a broader global history. Following their example, we dare to explore some overlooked big questions about neoliberalism. First, how has neoliberalism produced a degree of legitimacy and consent to become the main source of inspiration to organize societies? Second, how has neoliberal democracy, which works as a dictatorship of capital rooted and founded on vast material inequalities, been produced, reproduced, and sustained? And lastly, what are the multiple and fragmented social foundations of neoliberalism as a system of domination? We start by identifying multiculturalism as one of the neoliberalism's greatest achievements, and we're critical of it, right? I'm not saying that, oh, how great. We're critical in terms of the social foundation there. Meaning as a tool to redefine the categories of difference that popular sectors now adopted as their own in order to carve out space in this new political economy. The essays by Diana Bocarejo and Carlos del Cairo on campesinos movements, or by Marta Dominguez on Afro-Colombian communities in the Pacific Coast, illustrate with ethnographic detail how multiculturalism is more than a tool of domination, but a political lingua franca to negotiate inclusion and exclusion, right? The legitimacy of those processes within a common neoliberal framework. Then we surveyed the territorial state and how specific regions participated in the making of extractivism as a new paradigm to reshape the role of the state in the economy. The essay by Astrid Ulloa on the resistance of indigenous Wayuu people on the Guajira to large-scale coal mining and green energy activities sheds light on how communities affected by extractivism, which is the main economy of the neoliberal democracy, are also at the vanguard of thinking integral and long-lasting solution to the existential crisis brought about by this neoliberal model. The last debate that we address in these two volumes is memory and violence. And this, the last section examines the collapse of the state and society during the last decades of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st. First, by connecting the illegal drug business and other forms of violence with public discourses, we explain how media representations, routines, strategies, and participants have actively contributed to the tensions between peace and war. We also show how the media has played a fundamental role in the making of neoliberalism a common language of contention, while counter-hegemonic media initiatives had resisted the parameters and the terms of the neoliberalization of society. So we try to show that particular struggle. For example, the essay by Alex Fatal on the work and public persona of photojournalist Jesus Abad Colorado sheds light on the fundamental role that the media, with religious and ideological underpinnings, have played in documenting human resilience of violent, repressed communities that have dared to imagine alternative political horizons. We also dig deeper into the logics and patterns of violence, in which different authors explore, through ethnographic research and social cultural analysis, the history of drug trade, of the armed conflict, and the everyday practice of resistance accommodation to insurgent and paramilitary orders and disorders. The essay by our art curator Santiago Rueda and Harold Ortiz is a good example. It unfolds like a series of conversations among journalists, cartoonists, opinion makers, artists, and others from different regions and different ethnic backgrounds on the narco, phenomena, a concept they use to refer to the diversity of art, architecture, fashion, music, and cultural manifestations associated with the drug trade, even tourism, we could actually be included there as well. This imprinting of oral history constitutes a collective exercise of memory that advances a critical view of how violence associated with the cocaine industry has been commodified as a spectacle for mass consumption. Finally, rejecting narrow definitions of violence, we reconceptualize the internal armed conflict as beyond the logics of armed confrontation, to examine the nuts and bolts of everyday life in war zones, including the political struggle over how to narrate, remember, and memorialize the conflict, making, remembering, and retelling crucial practices in the struggle for truth, justice, and reconciliation. For example, the essay that closes the volume 2, is a collective work of remembering and retelling produced by Pilar Riaño Alcalá in collaboration with Natalia Quinceno, Camila Orjuela, José de la Cruz Valencia, and the community of Bojayá in the Departamento of Chocó in the country's Pacific coast. For years, Riaño Alcalá accompanied the efforts for truth and justice of an Afro-Colombian community that survived a massacre perpetrated by the FARC in 2002, when 102 children and adults were killed inside a Catholic church. The essay analyzed forensic processes of recovering the bodies of their loved ones, get them exhumed, identified, and properly buried in their territory, following their ancestral knowledge and practices to care for the dead.
So I want to call attention to two photos here on the screen. The one at the bottom, which is from the essay that Ricardo just mentioned, and the other one that comes from the Fatales essay, which we mentioned, that is about the photojournalist Jesus Abad Colorado. They're both from the same town, from Bojayá, and from the same event, violent event, the massacre that happened in May 2002. This is a photo from inside the church, obviously after all the bodies have been buried in a mass grave, which is the story that Riaño Alcalá and others tell in their essay. So I just want to kind of like make that connection, because many times the essays are in conversation with one another that way. So just to conclude before we open for conversation, which is what we're most interested in, a brief comment about some of the methodologies that we used. Because these two volumes are definitely a collective effort, not just because all edited volumes are by definition a collective effort, but also because it has many different layers of collaborations happening here. So on the one hand is a dialogue among multiple scholars with different positionalities, generations, etc., but also different interdisciplinary perspectives. And the idea was to open a space to talk about these histories of Colombia. So one of the layers of collaboration is obviously among the two of us as the editors and the initiators or instigators of this project, identifying shared experiences, perspectives, and motivations. Then there's another layer of collaboration, which was looking for works that represented disciplinary diversity from both big and small public and private universities, institutions in Colombia, in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, because the books are coming out in English. So we were looking for works in the English-speaking world. But many of the works that were produced in Colombia by Colombians working there were initially produced in Spanish, and then we have to engage in a process of translations and all the politics of translation that entail. We can be more detailed if you guys are interested in that process and tell you a little bit more about how it happened. And the third final layer of collaboration and collective work was the peer review methodology, and this is what we have here on the screen. So it was based on solidarity and collegiality rather than anonymity and secrecy. And by that we mean that because we have such a tremendous diversity of topics, of disciplines, volume 1 is mostly by historians but not exclusively. The essay that I mentioned about the politicians and the paradigm of development from the point of view of policymakers and presidents and politicians, that's produced by economists who are doing historical work, archival work. And there's also a musicologist that is also working, doing archival research as a historian, but his discipline is musicology, and he himself is a musician. But the rest of the authors in volume 1 are historians. Volume 2, Perplexity, that's the one that is completely and absolutely interdisciplinary. They're political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, media scholars, critical theory, philosophy, etc. and using all different kinds of methodologies and including 2 conversations. The first essay is a conversation between a philosopher and an Afro-Colombian intellectual, which was the previous photo here, this one, Manuel Zapata Olivella, who passed away decades ago. So this conversation happened in the early mid-2000s before he passed away. And then another conversation that is the one that Ricardo just mentioned by our curators, Santiago Rueda and Harold Ortiz, who had a series of conversations in different parts of the country with different kinds of people, and then transcribe those conversations, and it's that big impromptu oral history about narco phenomena in the country. But we have different kinds of methodologies. So in the case of the peer review, we realized very early, along with our editors at Routledge, that it was not possible to have just 1 or 2 anonymous readers, because who are going to be able to say something meaningful and really helpful from like the early 19th century until now, with all these different disciplines and these different debates. So we have to come up with a different methodology, and what we ended up doing was a week of panels, like a private conference among ourselves. And for each panel, we invited 1 or 2 peer reviewers. Some of them working on Colombia, some of them working on other countries in Latin America, but their themes and topics or methodologies were relevant for that particular panel. And each panel ended up being more or less the different sections in which the book is organized. And these are photos of that. We ended up uploading everything to YouTube. Obviously, it's private. Only we who had the code can access those 2 hours conversation for each one. At the end, we're 11 in total. And you have just the photos right there, so everybody connected through Zoom. It was in the middle of the pandemic as well, so we were not going anywhere really. So Zoom was very helpful. And we just discovered that type of peer review, because it was very rigorous, and we had some like difficult conversations, and you know, in even arguments and things like that, right? But we realized that face-to-face peer review was actually a great idea, and it worked really well. And we shared bibliography with everybody, and we gave comments, and then one comment served as a foundation for a larger conversation about whatever topic that ended up being relevant not only to the author of that particular essay, but for many others as well. The people who were participating in other panels obviously were invited to attend a different one, so like ended up being kind of like a virtual conference, and working really well. So that's why we wanted to bring that up as well, so you guys are aware of that, because we mentioned it very briefly in the prologue, but not all of you had the opportunity to read it. So just to conclude, before we open to a conversation, we want to say that for us, it was this type of conversation was very important because of the moment that we are living in, when democracy seems to have entered a permanent state of emergency around the world. When states of countries that were considered beacons of democracy, like Canada or here the United States, have engaged in genocide against their own peoples and other peoples far away across the planet, when systematic violation of human rights against the most vulnerable populations has become an everyday occurrence. We like to offer the histories of Colombia as illustrations of worldwide historical struggles over what it means to be part of a democratic society, and especially over what democracy is supposed to do. So these are not unique or exceptional histories, as much of the scholarship on Colombia has suggested. These are examples of the planetary discussion of ideas, realities, and practices of what it means to live in a democracy and what should we expect from democracy. So we welcome your comments, questions, ideas, anything. Thank you.
Do you think democracy in such a vast country as Colombia is, with you have got like fiberless cities, but then you have areas that are very remote, do you think that contributes to like a difficulty in development? Like, how do you treat people out that aren't like providing to the democracy or providing to community as much as like the cities? Like, I mean, we have it here with like collegiate sports, like football brings in money for the university, but so they get like all the benefits, but like other sports still need benefits, but they don't bring in like money to the university. So is that, do we see that with democracies? Like the US is huge. We've got a lot of rural areas, Colombia the same. And so like I'm wondering if smaller countries with maybe more close-knit populations, their democracies are going to be better, more people have like the same views. Just what do you
Well, I think that's a conversation that is very old about how a homogeneous ethnic, racial, or whatever kind of homogeneity there is more conducive to a democratic society, and how diverse, heterogeneous societies are therefore more fragmented and therefore had it a more difficult time producing a democracy. But I think we are past that conversation long ago. Because on the one hand, the whole conversation about the role of diversity in a society started to happening decades ago with neoliberalism, as we were talking here about. The whole conversation about multiculturalism is a conversation that became really relevant as part of the neoliberal turn as well. And there's all kinds of approaches to that conversation, and right now we are here in a country that is dismounting, or at least the administration, the state is dismounting all the infrastructure for that diversity to actually exist and be a reality, right? So it's a very relevant conversation because it's affected our lives right now, and it has for a long time. In the case of Colombia, I think what Colombia really illustrates is a very interesting, it has been presented as a paradox, but it doesn't have necessarily to be a paradox. And that is the idea of centers and peripheries. And the peripheries of the country, those rural areas, right, that are not really contributing much to the wealth of the nation and all the stuff, right, because they're poor, they're isolated. The people that tend to live there are seen as kind of like inferior because they're not very well educated, or because they belong to races and ethnicities that are seen like not at the same level of civilization of the rest, right? For whatever reason it is, however they are characterized, the history of Colombia has been dealing with that tension between centers and peripheries. And one of the things that many of the authors in this volume discuss is how that idea of a country that is divided among central areas that are contributing directly to a democratic society and to the wealth of the nation, and peripheries that are kind of like an obstacle to development and an obstacle to democracy because they're inferior for whatever reason, is not accurate. And it was a construction, a discourse, an imaginary that it was created very early on in the 19th century, precisely to justify the inequalities on which the wealth of the nation was being distributed. So it's not something that happened naturally. It's the product of a specific political and ideological conflicts among different sectors that were different from each other in whatever way it was, racially, economically, etc. And how those conflicts and those fights, the legacies and the consequences of those conflicts and those fights is this type of discourses where the ones who lost a specific conflict are now seen as an obstacle to the future. And the ones who won are actually, precisely because they're the victorious ones, are the ones who are seen as the leaders of the futures and the ones that had the right to tell us where to go. but it's really the product of political conflicts and political struggle. There's nothing natural about that. The idea that is natural is in itself part of the conflict and part of the fight, right? You can chime in because I can give you some examples of specific essays that we have in the volume to be more specific, but I'm sure you have something else to say.
Well, a couple of points. Yes, the developmental paradigm at its core has this distinction, which actually come from late 19th century, which is the hierarchical distinction between what is rural and what is urban, and associate democracy with being in city. If you think about what has this particular idea produced, it's just you see what's going on with the world, right? It's being destroyed because that means consumption, that means so many other things. But here I think that the question has been brought up to for discussion as part of political movement would be a struggle over the definition of democracy. One that is that says, because neoliberalism is all about difference, but difference as hierarchy. So in that particular case, it's urban versus rural. So the hierarchization of the nation in that particular way, with questions of gender, questions of race, questions of class. But then you have another definition of democracy that advocates for, and I'm aware that I'm simplifying this, but they advocate for different as equality, right? So that is that particular tension, different as hierarchization of society, or different as inclusion, different as equality. You have those possibilities, right? So that then that's indeed the tension. That's what you see one of the main questions at stake, trying to be able to legitimize some of these political projects.
So a couple of examples, just to be more concrete and less abstract or conceptual. The essay by Catalina Muñoz, for example, that she's talking about cultural politics in the 1930s, right? And so far we had the idea that the liberals, when they came back to power in the 1930s, after more than 40 years of Catholic conservative rule, right, they came back with this agenda of reforms and modernization, right? We should be such a rigid Catholic conservative country. We need to open up in order to be modern, right? And achieve this paradigm of development that it was just starting at that time to take traction. So her essay shows how popular sectors, mostly in the cities, but also in rural areas, were confronting those liberal elites that apparently came with a very open agenda of reforms, right? But were also very elitist and very paternalist. And they think because they were the educated ones, right? The white mestizo ones, they were the ones telling the rest of the country, how are we going to do this thing called development and modernization? And you guys just follow us and obey. And what she shows is that the popular sectors were fighting against their own liberal leaders. It's not that they were fighting their enemy, the conservative enemy. No, they were fighting their own liberal leaders, the ones that they respected, the ones that they follow, the ones that they voted for, pushing them to be more daring, more less paternalist, less elitist, more open to popular culture, to rural culture, the idea of folklore, for example, coming from rural communities and rural societies that were seen as inferior, right, as uncivilized, as savage, as primitive. They were the ones who pushed the liberal elites to accept that and integrate that into the cultural politics of the liberal state. So it's not the elites from the city, educated white men, right? It's the people from below in their tremendous diversity, many of them not even literate, completely illiterate, fighting politically for a different type of education, access to culture, recognition of folklore as a legitimate form of culture and part of what the Colombian nation should integrate and value and finance and support and etc. So that's a very specific example of how these hierarchies of rural, urban, no educated, not educated, central, peripheral, etc., are actually categories that are the result of very specific political conflicts.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. Just I'm eager to dig into the volumes. The question that I had, I mean, many of us in the room are Latin Americanists of different sorts, right? But we also, as Latin Americanists, we also come from perhaps from being specialized in one particular country. You know? So I wanted to and you already alluded to this relationship between being historians of Colombia and then working within broader frameworks. No, so how do you, in your maybe in your own work or in the work that you've put into the into organizing this collective volume, how do we bridge that tension? I mean, there is a tension between national histories and just histories of Latin America. Right? Both as researchers and I will add another layer to the question of as teachers as well.
Yeah.
How much time we have?
I know it's a massive
You know,
question.
you want to start? Well, I would answer as follows. For me, this is something that it is interesting to me what often passes as Latin America in the United States. So what is the idea of the United States and what countries represent Latin America? Colombia is usually not necessarily the case unless you talk about from the United States, well, the two-party system and then the institutionalization of democracy. So one could actually say, wait, let me use the example of Colombia to see some patterns here. But I would say the first step for me is to dismantle some of what I would call these fantasies about Latin America, right? So that would actually and there's a very difficult task to do, right? Like you would actually have to read all the literature produced in the since the 1950s, from modernization theory to the present. And what is fascinating to me is that as much as we criticize the modernization theory, there are some arguments that are very much with us, right? So that for example, the hierarchization of Latin America according to degrees of democracy. So you have Uruguay, for example, is still the idea of democratic society, and that comes from the 1950s with particular ideas about racial homogeneity, right? The formation of the middle class, no tension, everybody's happy there. There's unification. The first step would actually
A
be
small country.
yes. So yeah. So that would actually be the first step for me, to be able to historicize those fantasies in the United States. The second one would actually be, which is part of what we do here, is to produce knowledge truly in a transnational way that goes beyond what the United States does say about Latin America. And I know that I don't want to name names here, but I do think that in some cases, arguments that become what Latin America is all about in the United States has been produced in Latin America, and I'm not talking about plagiarism. I'm talking about the way how knowledge production gets done, right? Like something comes from Latin America, becomes part of a transnational, larger global discussion, but it's now coming from the United States. So the condition of the United States make it global, universal. So that's the second step. I would say produce truly transnational knowledge. We did try to do that. I like to think that we achieved that part, include knowledge production from Colombia, from the United States, from other places in Europe, always aware of how power is at work here. And then the third part, which is also that we try, but it's very difficult to do, is to universalize some of these questions. Hence the question of democracy, that we approach it as a universal question, and that means that, for example, in the case of Latin America during the Cold War, of course, Latin America, Colombia is always like, well, we didn't have a real dictatorial rule, but if we dare ask and say, well, but certain practices that happen in Colombia, right, under a how to put it, institutionalized or formalized democracy, right? what happened in dictatorial rule. The point is not to say, well, it is just happening in Colombia too. That brings the question of what is the relationship between dictatorial rule and democracy as a discourse. What do we do? How we historicize that particular relationship? So it goes beyond a comparative framework without forgetting the comparative framework. I think it's important, but to reframe the question and see, particularly from our present, what is the relationship between dictatorial rule practices and democratic discourses. We cannot forget that so many dictatorial regimes throughout Latin America, they use the language of democratic society, right? Like you need to wait, experience dictatorial rule. Once you do, then you're going to be ready to live in democracy. They're using democracy as an utopia. So let's question that. Let's think about this question. So I would mention those three. None of them are easy to do, but I think they're actually quite important if we want. And that would actually be the last one. If we want, we meaning the Americas as a whole. If we want to question the monopolization of what Latin America is from the United States, scholarship. They do have. Well, we do have. I mean, I'm not going to deny that I'm part of the U.S. academia as well. But there is a monopolization that we need to question and open up other possibilities to tell histories otherwise.
Just one thing that occurs to me is that one of my mentors and one of our elders, to put it in a way, is Charles Berquist, who passed away 5 years ago, something like that. And he wrote mostly about Colombia, but not exclusively. He did a lot of labor history, a lot of political history. He has a great book about the War of the Thousand Days, which was a war in Colombia at the end of the 19th century that really is a watershed in the constitution of the country as a coffee economy, as a bipartisan political system. And he wrote, I think, the best book about that, in my opinion. And one of the things that he did at some point in his career was to write a history of the United States from a Latin American perspective. And the title is exactly The Course of American Democracy. And by American democracy, he's not talking about the US. He's talking about democracy in the Americas, right? And he has a fantastic essay there about it's kind of like a counter-historical in a way, because it's very counterintuitive. And it's about how the history of development of the United States would have looked like if the South would have won the Civil War instead of the North. And his hypothesis is like, well, it would look very much like a Latin American country. And then he, it's a little essay that is in this book. But I always remember that essay just because first it's so daring. How do you dare to ask that question, right? Then how you dare to answer that question, right? And produce a counter-historical argument, which we historians, we don't do. Political science do that. They're like, what if this had happened? And then we historians go crazy and it's like, that's diabolical, we don't do that, right?
Malpractice.
But what I'm saying is that way of thinking outside the box is really what we need now. More comparative history, more history of the Americas from a Latin American perspective or from the global South or whatever category you want to use, right? And more transnational history from that perspective. And asking big questions. Manuel Zapata Olivella, who was one of the photos that we just mentioned, the Afro-Colombian intellectual, he was also like that. I mean, he was asking these big questions that he barely scratched the surface trying to answer them. But he was thinking big, right? And we took that as an inspiration, and it's the first essay in volume 2 in Perplexity, the conversation with him, precisely because it inspired us to be more daring, and to think outside the box and to ask those questions that is like, how you dare? Like, yes, dare, because if not now, when?
and I'm just gonna add, there have been, it's actually, possible to write those, histories in which the category of Latin America appears as the main, category. Is actually, possible. And what I mean by this is like, for example, if we think about, we will actually have the concept of class, right? Bear with me for a moment, all right? But let's think about, elites, right? So then you have, is there anything Latin American about, the elites in terms of their own class identity, in terms of how they achieve, class power, historically speaking? My argument will be that, there are so many shared projects among elites across, the Americas, so that there is nothing necessarily Latin American about, the elite, formation as historical subject. And if that's the case, I'm hypothetically speaking here, if that's the case, then, what does this concept Latin America actually, sort of who benefit from that particular, category, right? Here, of course, I'm speculating, right? I'm not, I don't have the argument perhaps just yet, but I think it's actually, for me important, if it is at all possible to think about, histories that are not necessarily mandated by either the nation state or, the regional, identity. And if that's the case, then what concept we would actually, use in order to tell histories in a different way. But it's, all right.
In terms of parallels, if we want to like kind of tie it back into the States right now, I think what you guys mentioned, just the idea of like democracy, you have to work for it, you have to earn it, and I think Colombia went through that a lot earlier than we are right now. I feel like the U.S. right now is in a spot where it's like, we're asking, or we're saying, you can't do that to the Republican Party, and they're like, we are and we will. You know what I mean? Like there's no basis to like breaking the rules to such a level. Mm-hmm. And I feel like Colombia used to be like that, like you mentioned, when like liberals came into power in the 70s. And the people said, well, actually, let's not. Like you mentioned, like it's like, just because you think it is a good idea, doesn't mean it's what the people want, mm-hmm. for example. Obviously, this is kind of flipped on its head. Now we have arguably the fascists in charge, as opposed to like the liberal saviors that used to, that was kind of the hope for Colombia in the 70s. But how that's developed, especially into like the 90s and 2000s with Uribe, like how it to me it feels like, as a Colombian, like that led us, like kind of that failure of the liberal party, mm-hmm. to set like a proper democracy and like a good process that we all buy into, led us into Uribe, which, Uribe, number one, everybody loved him, right? Trabajar. Yeah. We were all about it, right? But then now we have Uribe 2 and 3, yeah. And especially 3, when it's like, what the fuck are we doing? Like, but like, I think you would agree, or you tell me, I feel like at that point now I already moved to the States, so maybe I wasn't as connected to Colombia politics. But Uribe number 3, like, I think people were all for it. Like, for the most part, like, the population was like, yes, like, this is a good idea. And obviously now we know it was a huge mistake, and it's kind of led to the end, like, a little bit of stagnation in Colombia, like politically speaking. Obviously, let's not talk about Petro and how he may be failing or not at his promise. But do you see kind of like that parallel with like the Democratic Party in the States currently, and at least especially since the Obama years, where to me it feels like we as the Democratic Party in the U.S. failed at making the country realize that, even if you don't agree with all the policies or, like the quote unquote direction of the country, that there needs to be a baseline of democracy and civil rights and respect, between you and me, between political parties, between different genders, races, whatever you want to call it. Do you think that's kind of what's happening here? Like the fact that we didn't take that advantage of like a stable situation, a stable few years, maybe a decade or so, and now we're kind of seeing that the consequences of that.
There's so much to say. I don't even know where to start, but I'm gonna just like let my mouth run, right, and see what happens.
We learn anything from Colombia,
first,
right?
I do believe that there's a tremendous historical parallel, that is not coincidence, that is a common history of the failure of a bipartisan system. It's not gratuitous that in Colombia, I have always characterized, because I'm actually thinking through this right now for my second book, the 20th century in Colombia, it could be characterized as the century of intimacy with the US. And how we as a country, Colombia, with our project for development, modernity, democracy, all those big words, are dependent on a relationship with the Colossus of the North, which was the term used at the early 20th century, right? And how we define our identity as nation state in relation as a relation of dependency, subordinated dependency with the United States, right? So it's not gratuitous that the Colombian political system organized itself as a bipartisan system for most of the 20th century until Uribe car bombed it, because that's what he did, right? He car bombed it. It's not gratuitous because we were really making big efforts to copy the US because it was about importing the discourses, the ideas, the technologies, etc. And the history that hasn't been told, which I aspire to do at least in relation to drug history, is the other way around. What were the things that the US imported from Colombia, right? Besides, obviously, coffee and marijuana and cocaine. But what else beyond that? What else came with those commodities, right? So I think both countries are exemplary of the failure of a bipartisan system, and how the belief is the fantasy is that by creating a bipartisan system, you create like a magnetic, electromagnetic field of force, where everything is possible within these two possibilities. And what they both show is that these two possibilities, instead of creating an expansive field of force, what create is a restrictive field of force, and the two ends end up being the same thing, just the Janus face, each facing a different side, but they're the same thing. I don't really see much of a difference between Democrats and Republicans, and I don't want to get into controversy about that. Let's stay in Colombia. But I don't see much of a difference, right? I was listening to this interview with journalist Chris Hedges, who was one of the big editors of the New York Times for decades until he was fired. And he was talking about Trump 2.1 is the product of a fight, a political conflict between corporatists, neoliberal corporatists, the Democratic Party, and neoliberal oligarchs, the Republican Party. They're the same people, just Janus face looking at the other opposite sides. Similar happened in Colombia between liberal and conservatives after narco-trafficking and Uribe, which are also the same thing, car bomb the whole thing, right? But I think they both cases are cases of the failure of the bipartisan system as the ideal type of political party system in which to organize a stable constitutional order. Because what we see is that the constitutional order is subverted from within, which is what happened in Colombia before and is happening now. We have a beautiful constitution, the most progressive constitution in Latin America, the Constitution of 1991. And it's on paper. Because, yes, I'm not saying that there's no reality to that. That constitution became a reality because of the social mobilization of the people. So that you have democracy in action on the streets, from below, from the middle, from the elites as well, because there were a lot of progressive elites that participated in making that happen and possible, right? But again, it's been not really respected, not really implemented, not really executed. And here what we see in my ignorance, because I'm not very knowledgeable about US history or US politics, but what I understand is that that's exactly what's happening as well. You know, the constitutional order, and to the point that a lot of people are talking now about a constitutional crisis, right? When do we draw the line of so much disobedience against the constitutional order? So that definitely, I think that is a parallel because it's a common history. And what I think that some of the lessons that Colombia can teach to the US right now, having gone through hell and back, and who knows, maybe back to hell again, we'll see. But the point is that I think the main lesson is that those aspirations for equality, for democracy, for redistribution of wealth, for all those principles, they're not going anywhere. And people are still fighting for them. So, and with the climate crisis and existential crisis that we are going through, and it's only gonna deepen and become, more chaotic and dystopian, I think those principles and those ideals are not gonna die. Actually, they're the only ones that are gonna keep us alive with some hope. So I think that's what Colombia shows, that those aspirations are not easily asphyxiated, suffocated, or buried.
Very quickly, just I would add that the main task here that I think Histories of Colombia do teach us is to rethink the very framework of how we approach what is often considered a crisis. So if you pay attention to the language now and elsewhere, is the crisis of democracy. Democracy is in danger. That activity is dangerous, and no matter what you actually locate yourself, sometimes the language is indeed shared. The threat of to democracy, and this of course would actually be an invitation or even a provocation. But what happens if we actually think that the answer is not democracy, but actually democracy should actually be the question. If we reframe that, then perhaps we are in a different place to start thinking about other possibilities, right? So because when you actually take democracy as a given, then that's what you have, right? Like and a naturalized vision of democracy. So perhaps what Histories of Colombia do teach is to think democracy as a question and not as an answer.
Others? I have a question. Thank you so much. This is a really wonderful overview because I will read every page of the two volumes, but now I have a leg up, so I really appreciate that. I wonder, I was fascinated by the peer review process, predictably, I suppose. And I wonder what you would say are the key benefits of doing it that way as opposed to anonymous peer review through the press. And if you're willing to, without names, talk about some of the controversies, sort of how I think in the anonymous review process we have kind of a stagnant exchange, right?
Mm-hmm.
The author makes the manuscript, the reviewer sends the critique in many different forms, right? Some very direct, others not so much. And I wonder how you think in those controversies an opportunity to be interactive shaped how those peer reviewers' comments were integrated. You mentioned that they were very useful, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I don't have the extensive notes that we obviously took during this whole week, and the videos are still there, and we have access to them, of course. So just like making a little memory exercise here, I think, well, one of the advantages is that it stimulated conversations, because sometimes, no, many times when you receive a review, it's just a few pages that at some point they're gonna infuriate you and ruin your day, right? And you need to kind of like prepare yourself psychologically, emotionally, everything to read the reviews, right? And then you make an effort to kind of like take the 2 or 3 things that you consider interesting and grains of truth and like use that to make revisions, right? And you talk to the editor of the journal or the press, and then you decide, okay, this is my plan forward. This is what am I gonna do? Are you gonna be happy if I do that? Or like, how much do I need to incorporate of what they suggested me? But many times you get the feeling that this person didn't read well, and if they read, they didn't really get you. You know, well, we dealt with all that face to face and in real time, right? So we were able to respond to each other in real time and telling like, but no, wait a minute, you misinterpreted. That's not what I wrote. And then the other will say, but what? So you need to write it differently because that's what it says, right? And then the exchange happened. I don't remember specific examples, maybe only two, but not in great detail. One was about the term and the concept of campesino, because one of the essays that we actually mentioned about multiculturalism and all this stuff addresses that history from the point of view of the campesino movement. So I remember being a controversy about what they meant by the term campesino and what is a campesino movement and how to translate that to English. So we decided not to do it. Sometimes we put in parentheses like sometimes campesino is translated as peasant, but it's not necessarily, you know, a good translation. But the controversy was about how you characterize the campesino movement in Colombia. And I don't remember the details of the whole thing, but it was a long conversation and a lot of back and forth. But it was great that we all were there because we really were able to say things instead of just responding to one or two points, right? We were able to have a conversation about that. The other one was about the role of the drugs economy in the country, because for some of the authors working on that topic, they have a more kind of like conservative, classic approach, which in Colombia it reads as el flagelo del narcotráfico, right? That narco trafficking has been a pest and an obstacle and just the worst thing that could happen to the country. While other people were seeing, you know, the reasons why the drug economy laid roots in the country is because not everything is bad. Because it brings economic stability to communities that have nothing else. Otherwise, well, they will starve to death. You know, like because it connects peripheral abandoned areas of the country through illegal means, right, and through many times, you know, violent means, but still connect them to the national markets and the international markets. So we were having that conversation about, okay, wait a minute, we cannot. Looking at the drug trade and the role of the drug trade in the recent history of the country only from a demonizing point of view, right? We need to go and have a more on the ground point of view and understand the legitimacy that these type of economies have for the people that make a living and find subsistence through that type of economy, right? And I remember that being another kind of like a controversy that we had. And again, we didn't necessarily agree on anything. I mean, you will read the essay by Eduardo Sáenz Rovner, for example, who does classical archival research on drugs, and he has the point of view that narco trafficking is the worst thing that ever happened to Colombia, and thank God for the U.S. that imposed the war on drugs, otherwise it will be worse, right? And other people that think the opposite, that the war on drugs is the worst that had happened, that narco trafficking has some advantages, right? And that we need to think more layered, that kind of conversation. So those are kind of like two examples of really heated debates that we had during the peer review process.
I would add to this, well, you know, three things. You know, the first one, this, you know, peer process allow us to achieve what I referred, you know, before as, you know, this transnational knowledge production, because in some cases the anonymous, you know, review process doesn't take into account the material conditions of production. And what I mean by that is that the historiographical field sometimes have different questions and answers that are the ones that are being responded here. So as we had the discussion face to face, the author could actually address that right away. Well, this is kind of the historiographical field I am indeed, addressing, because sometimes what happens is that, in the anonymous, review, is like, you don't cite this, you don't cite that, you don't, and you are having, different discussion. We're having a discussion with, other, fields. So that allows us, to do that. The other one, we didn't succeed, but I think something important is to fight academic ego. I mean, this is, all of us are defined by this. I mean, it's not, I'm not passing judgment. All of us, just, this notion of academic ego that is so unconscious. We were able to, handle that a little bit. I mean, but, so there were moments, very difficult moments, and I have to say, Lina is really good at this, just, trying to make things happen. But, we try to do that as well with this, peer review process. Focus on, the discussion, arguments, not at the level of personal, right? So you can actually, and sometimes in the anonymous that will also happen, right? And the third aspect is that Lina and I play the role of mediators, right? Not just right there, but after the fact, right? See how some of these arguments were indeed important. Some of the arguments that were made by authors. I'm thinking particularly the one on the 1950s. That did get a lot of pushback, and then Lina and I were convinced that that chapter should actually be there. So we had some discussion, mediations between the author and reviewers and everything. All right. Okay.
Okay.
So there's three aspects there, and it is interesting, Liz, that this has caught the attention of a lot of people when they read this. I mean, we like to implement this as a more common practice. I think it is doable, it is possible. We did it, but of course the major assumption is that if we do it this way, we lose in rigor, and we can say that that's not the case. We did not lose any rigor at all. Quite the opposite. The discussions were actually quite leisure and productive, and definitely improve the content of both books.
Yeah. Well, I'm really intrigued, and I would say that right now, with the crisis in review, scholarly review that we already face, it would be a great contribution, not only that people notice, but I'm sorry to give you more work, if there was an essay or a panel, right, that would suggest that we could shift the basis of peer review in a way that enhances dialogue, and particularly helps us overcome the kind of north-south material conditions or misunderstanding divide that is really just very hard to do in the existing review process. And I think that would be, what you've achieved here, I think would be a really important model and a way actually to animate reviewers. If I had to show up on a Zoom and do my review in person, I would most certainly read even more carefully, right?
That's true.
I mean, there's a way of showing up that is also about accountability for the review process, and I think it's one of the most important ways to bring work to a higher level, and particularly in an edited volume. If the only thing people have was the initial conference to work from, which is a model for edited volumes, it sort of kind of brings it to another space that can be equalizing for the contributions of authors from different regions and with different languages. I'm fighting with UNM to get Zoom with translated captions. I've been fighting for 3 months now, so that people can participate in their own language, right? There's still going to be barriers, but I think it's really important when working with Latin America to remove some of the barriers to language that persist even among scholars.
That's so true. We have some panels where like somebody was like, I don't know, like in a rural area in Cauca. Another one was in like, I don't know, in Toronto. Another one was in like, we have a reviewer that was in La Paz in Bolivia, right? And different time zones, right? But we made them work that way, and it was wonderful, because otherwise you wouldn't meet with those people because of the circumstances. So yeah, that's true. We have had a lot of suggestions of like the next thing that we should do
Yeah,
together,
yeah.
from like volume 3
Yeah.
to essays on different things.
Yeah.
But this one, I think, is this is the one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is the one.
This
I
is
think
what you brought to Dr. Field's seminar too. It was like, how does this knowledge production happen, and the sort of mindfulness about it. So I volunteered to help with a panel that has North-South translation,
Yeah.
review. Like, I think that would be a really exciting.
And I mean, and I take that, suggestion, Liz, in this current, context in which the university, I'm sure you're aware of this, and the academia has, such a bad reputation, to put it, mildly. I mean, to rethink, some of the practices coming from, the academia, and see that the academia has a role in society, I think could actually, be around that. But, we have to rethink some of the values that we are governed by. And one of the ways is, and that was indeed, what we wanted to do, that it could actually, be something predicated on solidarity, right? Share interests, without forgetting the question of power. The question of power is always, present in terms of the material, conditions of power. I mean, we had the hardest time to find the resources to do, translations and, to pay for those translations, to do, the copy editing and, everything else. So, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the authors have to, apply for translation grants in their own universities to do their own essays, because we simply didn't have the money to do that. We got some money and we used it to do the very last layer of copy editing. Once everything was translated, not everything needed that type of editorial work. I mean, obviously the book had kind of like some copy editing, that's another story. But especially translated essays, many of them that imply a lot of ethnographic work, and therefore a lot of information from interviews and oral speech, and idiomatic expressions and things like that. So the translation was very tricky. So many of them found their own translators and money in their own universities to pay for that. Others, a few did it themselves, I think. Then we were kind of like the second layer, reading everything, comparing the Spanish with the English, making revisions, etc. And finally working with English as a second language editor. She's Mexican, but she's completely bicultural and bilingual, Mexican-American, I will say at this point. So, and that's her professional work. So she knows how to do English as a second language editing for academic work. And she was the very last layer at the end, right? So and we have not enough money, so we couldn't do all of the essays that we wanted, but we managed to pick, 7, 8, something like that, to work with her and make sure that the translation was on point. Many times we just preserve the original and then we just put something in brackets, like this is the closest translation that you have. One of the conversations about the narco phenomenon that has so many voices, because they have like 5 different conversations in 5 different moments in time in different cities of the country with different people. So all kinds of idiomatic expressions, slang, like things like that, that is what it gives the richness to the whole thing. How to translate that, So it was a tremendous challenge. So that was one of those. The work of Estefania Ciro with the Cocalero women in Caquetá. That was also very hard to translate because she has chunks of her interviews where people telling their life stories and part of their biographies and things like that. So, so that was very hard to translate as well, kind of like to keep the voices alive and not standardize them behind a flat English translation. So, so we just make the effort, and obviously it's not for us to judge if we achieve it or not. We know which ones we are happier than with others.
You don't have to tell.
Yes,
No,
no, we're not going to share that information.
And we won't tell. So, So that was part of also the collaborative thing, because we needed to work with many of the authors to make those translations possible. And it was a work of months.
Does anyone have a last question they want to? We're coming up on time. We've used a lot of your time and energy. But
I just have a curious question.
Yeah.
This is maybe for the room more than me. If any, what is your favorite or least favorite difference between like U.S. like academia and working here like in the U.S. compared to like maybe Colombia or Latin America?
Well, I haven't taught in Colombia or Latin America. When I was there, I was working as a journalist. Then I've been there many times, obviously doing research and many universities giving talks and events and conferences and things like that. But I haven't been a professor in a Colombian university, so I don't have that experience. So I cannot speak to that at all. I mean, I know my colleagues and I know what they're going through. So I don't know. One of the things that I do miss, but I don't even know if it's real and exists or is just a fantasy of mine, is the problem of translation and not of language. But because many things you just take for granted, and when you are in a classroom in the U.S. or at least in my university at Northwestern, where the student population is truly global, right? From like literally like anywhere in the world, right? I have to translate not only the language, which I'm actually not doing, because when I'm there, I'm thinking and speaking in English and whatever that is, but the basic information that I take for granted, right? And not just about Colombia, but about Latin America and the Caribbean in general, which is what I teach. I wonder how would it be to do that in Colombia or in Latin America, where I assume many things I don't even have to address or explain from scratch, because everybody will know more or less what we're talking about. So, yeah.
Well, I don't have a specific answer, to that, and the reason maybe is just because it does open up so many questions, for me. Just a little bit of personal history. I grew up in the academia, so I'm familiar with all the problems, the fantasies, the hierarchies, and there are a lot of shared ground. We like to think that there are, of course, there are again material conditions, but there are a lot of shared ground, there. So sometimes I find difficult to make that clear cut distinction. But what I do see, of course, is that here in the United States, I indeed authorized, and that add a layer of how you approach the knowledge production, right? So here I am a faculty of color. In Colombia, I am a white mestizo. I am indeed the quote unquote the norm, and that adds something. So but I approach this question critically, right? What happens when from your positionality you say certain things. What is the authority that is indeed embedded in what your body embedded in your body reflects? So that would actually be the main difference. And I do say this to my students here in the United States. Just to say that the fictional part of race as a category, the hierarchization of society and everything, but I think that would actually be my main aspect as I approach the academia in both places. And because at the end of the day, and I include you, here the knowledge we produce here in the United States, we always try to find ways to have discussions in Colombia. We definitely that's something that we try to do. So that part is more they say more equal in terms of what we want to do. But the part that as you get otherized, there are some other layers of how you produce that knowledge about that place called Colombia. That most people know something about Colombia, either because of narcos or because I don't know. There are so many stereotypes about Colombia.
Magical realism.
Yeah, something like that, right? Which is even quite common among some scholars even. But how you approach that particular question when you are being categorized as Colombia. And there are another discussion about that we have in the book, which is Colombian and Colombians, right? Latin American and Latin Americanist. The notion of Latin American is indeed creation of outside, right? So all of those layers, I take those into consideration in critical ways to produce knowledge about some of these aspects. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, that's a nice question to end on. Thank you very much, everybody, for your participation. I brought flyers.
Oh, in color. I
Yes.
brought those in black and white.
Which will
Okay.
remind you of the book,
Yes.
and it offers a discount on the hardcover.
20%. The irony is not that, and that's that,
No.
as we talk about, the material conditions, the books are really expensive, but the
The
paper,
ebook is available,
it is
it's
available.
more affordable,
Yeah.
and the
the paperback.
paperback is coming at the end of this year.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and I think the ebook is, if I can share, is $35.
Yeah,
It's
the
on
ebook
sale.
is perfect. That's what I think has been selling.
Yeah.
That's the thing. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.